I must say, Len, I have a reputation for being prepared for these briefings. And you know, they have this saying about behind every successful male is a brilliant woman. Well, in our case, as Cedric knows, we live in a matriarchal society here. I get briefed by ladies in the library who are here. Where are those ladies? They should stand up and they won't reveal themselves. But anyway, they prepared me with a whole series of info sheets and documents, and I must say that I found it extraordinarily difficult to read those papers. The details of what you are doing in the field and with whom you are doing it were really stunning to me. If you've had the experience of seeing your children die and come home to bury others, it's an unbelievable experience. And to think that this is happening by the hundreds of thousands of children every day for various reasons, many of them preventable, is really heartbreaking. So I really have concluded that you're just not a civilian employee of a well-known agency, but a kind of a Mother Teresa, because to put up with that specter every day and to know what's going on out there and to know that, of course, you've got only limited resources, it's got to be really a horrendous thing, and yet to maintain your joyful personality. So my hat's off to you, and I really didn't appreciate it until I started trying to go through those briefing papers. It was extraordinarily difficult. Perhaps it would be a good idea to start with a little history. For those of us old enough, we remember care as care packages, and you've come a long way from that day. In those days, it was, I guess, supported privately and by government agencies. How do you handle the finances today? Who are the benefactors of the program?
Well, let me, and thanks for your generous introduction. I will just start by saying I am definitely no Mother Teresa. You know, it's the people who work in the field, and it's our 12,000 staff around the world who are really the ones who are the real heroes and heroines. We have an incredible staff of people who keep me motivated and inspired when I go out in the field and see the kind of work that they're doing. And so, you know, really all hats off to them. And, you know, what I hope that I can do is to stay in touch enough so that I don't forget why I'm doing what I'm doing, and do what I can to facilitate their ability to do the work that they do. But it is an incredible and an awesome responsibility. You know, just to give people a little bit of background, because I think, you know, care is a little bit like the blind man and the elephant. Depends on what part you're touching, what you know. And I think a lot of people, you know, do know if they've got any gray hair. They remember CARE as the care package organization. If they don't, they think care packages were invented by their parents. But you know, we started out about almost 62 years ago, providing relief to people who had been devastated by World War II and were really part of the rebuilding of Europe after World War II. And then after you know, Europe was up on its feet again, we recognized that we had this incredible organization that could respond to people in the most dire of circumstances. And so, you know, we extended that, started working in Asia, and ultimately in other parts of the developing world, really focusing on emergency relief, looking at people who were affected by human or natural disasters. But I think we also recognize that, you know, while it's important to respond to people in crisis, in the long run, if we wanted to have a real long-term and sustainable impact, it was really looking at a longer-term view. And so from delivering care packages and from providing direct services for populations around the world, we really have continued to evolve to really look at what is it going to take to have the greatest impact on people around the world who are living in extreme poverty. You know, that 1 billion people who live on less than $1 a day and who are trapped in extreme poverty. And what is it going to take to really be able to have an impact? You know, we want to do more than just improve people's lives. You can build a well, you can provide food, you can build a school and increase children's access to education. But if you're not also looking at what are the underlying factors, you know, what are the things that keep people trapped in poverty? So we think of ourselves as looking at both the consequences, but also the underlying causes, and those are things like marginalization, discrimination, inequality, poor governance, and you know, a lot of the things that kind of this overarching environment that keep people trapped in poverty. So we focus on people's direct human needs, but we also look at, you know, issues of people's position in society, policy frameworks, overarching environment, and all of those things when we think about it. So, you know, if we enter into a community and start working with a program to get microfinance to women who want to start small businesses, we use that as a vehicle to also work with women around their status in life, and also use that as a way for them to send their children to school and really start kind of a virtuous cycle. So, you know, we try to look at this in a very holistic way. Your question about finances, you know, that's evolved a lot too. Early on, organizations like us were very much funded by both private donations, but increasingly by government funds. And probably about 5 to 10 years ago, 75% of our resources would have come directly from the federal government. We've really tried to diversify that a lot for a variety of reasons. One, because it's never a good thing to be that dependent on any one source of funding. Two, public sector funding always comes with strings. We want to be able to have access to public sector funding. As a taxpayer, I believe that, you know, I want my dollars to go to organizations like CARE, because I think we have a real responsibility, and, you know, we're not doing enough. On the other hand, to be able to have diverse pools of resources allow us to be much more flexible. So we get resources from corporations, private individuals, and now increasingly from large foundations like the one that I just left. So
I hope you maintain that contact.
I have maintained very good contact. I left on in good standing.
You sent him a Christmas card.
I do all that.
Mrs. Bill as well.
All of that.
Well, what can, I mean, all of us are just individuals here, no representatives of major foundations that we know of. How can the individual help? I mean, what can an individual citizen do to help CARE other than perhaps send them some money once in a while?
Well, I think there's a lot that people can do, and obviously contributions are important. You know, we rely a lot on individual contributions, and every little bit does help and make a difference. And we right now have a major donor who is matching pledges. So people, you know, if you send in $5, it gets multiplied to being 10. So, you know, I think people can't underestimate what a difference it makes to make even a small contribution. That aside, you know, I think there's a lot that can be done. I mean, one, you know, we live in a global world, and I think us understanding more about the issues of the rest of the world makes us better citizens and makes us better able to be good citizens even here in our own country. So I think getting involved, understanding the issues, and just, you know, being able to be informed citizens around the issues related to the rest of the world and global poverty. But also we have a network of volunteers, and who was saying they went to the conference last year. We have the CARE Action Network, which is a nationwide network of people who we can send out an email and they will call their congressperson when there's a bill that's going on the floor that would have policy implications for the global poor. And every year we have a conference in Washington, D.C., where this network of volunteers comes to Washington, learns about the issues that CARE is involved in, and then goes and lobbies their congressperson around key issues, usually 3 or 4 key issues that are really timely, that really give voice to the poor in Washington. And so that advocacy voice, having that network of volunteers who can come together once a year in Washington, but more importantly, during the year, when we've got campaigns going on, when there are things that we feel it's important that our policymakers know that there are people who understand and care about these issues, incredibly important. You know, we see what we do in the field, reaching the 70 million or so people who our programs reach, as being critically important. But if we don't take that and amplify that into a voice, a movement, if you will, that really talks about these issues, you know, we're not utilizing the whole force of our organization. So we really feel strongly that the advocacy voice is a key component to what we do programmatically. And all of you can, you know, be a part of that.
Well, you know, it goes to really the mission of the Southern Center, because our job here is to try to expand people's knowledge about world affairs. And I must say that the opportunities for Americans to learn about world affairs are really shrinking rather dramatically. Right. So we've got a big job to do. I'd like to.
It also, sorry, just on that. I mean, you know,
because
it also, as you say that, you know, one of the things that we're also getting very involved in and thinking about is how do we use care and what we have to offer as a vehicle for educating children and young people about these issues, because our young people are growing up in a world today where they need to understand these things. They are going to be part of a global world, and if we can do more to use the platform that we have as an educational tool for young people, you know, I think that that will be a major contribution. And again, whether they ever go and do work internationally or not, I think they'll be better citizens in this world. They'll have a broader perspective. They won't get so concerned about some of the petty things that I think our young people get locked in today, when they understand that there's a whole world out there and there's a much broader context. And so, you know, it's another way of getting involved, if you will.
Sam Nunn was talking the other day about this effort he's making to broaden the knowledge of Americans about world affairs so they can vote the right way in the next, or at least have foreign policy issues injected into the presidential campaign, saying that that one of the first meetings he wanted to hold was on national service. So if we should get something like that, that might be a very interesting. Let me ask you about a question concerning public funding. You did something about a year ago now that some would say was reckless, and others would say was courageous. It had to do with farm aid and how it was distributed overseas. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how that system worked and why you left it.
Right, and that's the position that we took on a practice called monetization. And this is a practice where foods that are grown in the United States are bought from big agribusiness, shipped overseas, and then that food is converted into cash that then goes to programs that we can run, you know, involved in fighting poverty. Well, you know, this was a program that was started several decades ago, when there's some logic in doing it for a couple reasons. One, because so much of our aid had been traditionally tied to actually helping us in this country, and so there's this kind of this sense of reciprocal, we help out our farmers, and in some way it also helps people overseas. It also was a very different time in terms of the situation for American farmers. Well, today it really doesn't make sense on a couple of levels. First of all, it's an incredibly inefficient process. You buy crops here.
Who buys it?
The government. Yeah. You have to ship them on American carriers. It takes many months to get overseas, and then we become food traders overseas, because we actually have to store and store and do the transactions and convert it to resources. So very, very inefficient way, which at the end of that chain is money. Why not just give the money? In the analysis that was done, it estimated that for every dollar you lose about 33 cents in that transaction. So it's very inefficient, much more efficient to just give the dollars for the program. But on top of that, what it also probably has a real impact on is depressing the local ability to grow crops and get them to market. So we felt we had to take a stand, one, because it wasn't particularly efficient, but also because it was totally counter to what we're trying to do. We're trying to do economic development in countries where agriculture is their mainstay for for livelihood. So we're depressing their very ability to do exactly what we wanted. So we just felt it was so counter to what we were trying to do that we couldn't continue to be part of the system. Now, most of the other NGOs like us, large, non-governmental organizations that are involved in this business, agree with us. But most people weren't willing to take the stand that we did, which said we're willing to not take the government resources, which amounts for us to be about $45 million by the time we phase out of this program, because we just felt that it was not in keeping with our principles, and we just felt it was one of those things where at a certain point you have to live by your principles and, take the consequences. I think in the end, and we know from some of the countries that phased out of that monetization earlier, that we'll be able to figure out how to do cost recovery and replace those funds. In the short run, it is having an impact on some of our country offices who have really used those resources as the basis for a lot of their program. But at the end of the day, we just felt we had to do what was really in keeping with our long-term goals, and sometimes you have to take short-term consequences to achieve what you think are the longer-term goals. So,
So you don't think you're Mother Teresa, you just did it for...
I don't think I am Mother Teresa. I happen to have an organization of people who are Mother Teresa, and I just help them.
Speaking of Mother Teresa, you mentioned earlier in the micro-lending project, if you had a customer out there that you had to deal with, to use a marketing term, who would he be or who would she be?
For micro-lending?
For your projects overall, who you...
Well, we try,
what I'm trying to get at, in 06 or so, you started a major project dealing with women.
Oh, okay.
Tell us about that.
Well, our customers...
It was a subtle introduction, but you didn't get it.
It was a little too subtle, especially at this hour of the night, having just returned from Europe.
Cedric just flew in from Africa. He's here. His mind isn't here, but his body is here.
Right. Yeah, so women. I don't know how many people have seen our I Am Powerful ads in the airports and on TV and whatever. So a couple years ago, as we were thinking about how best to represent CARE's work, we realized that at the end of the day, we really all the research says that if you invest in women, you have the best long-term impact on whole communities. And so we just decided that in fact is where we're going to kind of put our stake in the ground. Not that we're an organization that only wants to see women's lives improved. We want to improve whole communities, but we do believe, and the research shows, that if you invest in girls and women, they change the outlook for families and communities. And if a woman gets educated, her children have a greater chance of surviving past age 5. If a girl goes to school, her income increases by 10 to 20% for every year of school that she has. If a woman makes decisions about use of household resources, it's spent in ways that go back and enrich the family. And so study after study show that that's where your best investment is. It also happens to be the right thing to do because women have been disproportionately left out of the development equation. Women have been disproportionately left out of education and health services and whatever. And so if you want to talk about a more balanced world, you have to think about how do you balance that with those who are disproportionately left out of the equation. So, we've really put a lot of our focus on how do you use the improvement of the lives of girls and women as our measure of success, again, knowing that that's the best way of helping to uplift whole communities. And that if to do that, you also have to work with boys and men, because you can't work on one side of the equation and think that, the problem is solved. And, we found that in some of our programs where if you only work on women and women change and they have a different sense of self, but if you haven't changed men's attitudes, then in some ways you've almost left women in a worse situation where they understand that life is different and life could be better, but then they still have to deal with the same attitude. So we recognize the need to, even in improving the lives of girls and women, that you've got to work on both sides of the equation.
You talked about economic development, but a tremendous amount of your work is in the field of HIV/AIDS. You've spent a lot of your working life in that field. How's the battle going? Are we winning, losing? Can you even use that kind of a term with AIDS?
We're doing both. We're winning and losing. HIV, continues to be one of the worst public health threats, and in some ways threats to humanity and economic stability. On the other hand, there are more and more countries now that have declining HIV rates, and some of those are in some of the countries that had some of the worst situations. So we're seeing declines in Botswana and Kenya and Haiti and Zimbabwe, a real stabilization. On the other hand, in Eastern Europe and in some parts of Asia, we're seeing increases. So it's both getting worse as it spreads to new parts of the world. It continues to be incredibly serious in parts of Southern Africa, where you can go to some places and have adult prevalence as high as 30 to 40%. So, and in some pockets, even 50%. So, half of this room would, if you were living in some corners of Lesotho, would be HIV infected. So it's serious. On the other hand, I think we've made incredible progress. More people have access to treatment. Mortality rates are starting to come down in some of the countries that have been most hard hit. And we are starting to see some plateaus.
Well, we hear that the epicenter in southern Africa is the Republic of South Africa. Apparently, President Mbeki has had a blind spot as far as this is concerned. Do you have any hope with the new administration that this is going to change dramatically so we can get a handle on what's going on there?
Yeah, the tragedy of South Africa is that they could have done so much more and so much earlier. When I first went to South Africa, when I was still at CDC, came over there to provide advice. That was late 80s, 88, 89. The rates of HIV infection were under 1%. Within a decade, the rates had climbed to about 25% in the adult population. Fastest growing epidemic that we've seen. Part of that is that we were attuned to it, so people were watching it. But nonetheless, to see it in that short period of time go from, a really, really low rate to, a quarter of the population, adult population or so, is pretty sad. On the other hand, just by virtue of the vibrant civil society that South Africa has, the resources that South Africa has, the response, even with Mbeki, has been better than some of the neighboring countries, just because they have the resources and they have some, incredibly courageous leaders. So there's a lot that's been done, but there's so much missed opportunity, and I think that's the sad part.
Well, the big countries supposedly inheriting the earth in the future are the so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, India, China, Russia. I saw something in the paper not long ago that really startled me. It was a notice that had been sent by the Chief of Staff of the Indian Army to the wives of all Indian soldiers saying, be careful, he may have AIDS. I don't know if you noticed that, but to have that sort of public notice in a society like that, in an institution like the Army, I think was somewhat startling. Is that something you've noticed to be a big problem in India with AIDS?
Well, India was one of the countries where there was the biggest fear about what was going to evolve. In southern India, the rates had actually gotten quite high, but it's one of the areas that very rapidly mounted a response, and so what seemed to have been the potential for a real runaway epidemic in India has actually looks like it's starting to turn around, and the numbers that were projected originally, for a while, we all thought that India had the second highest number of HIV-infected people, second only to South Africa. Part of that's population size. I mean, you got 1 billion people. Even if you have less than 1% infected, you still, have huge amounts. But nonetheless, there were some of the southern countries in India, southern states in India that had pretty high prevalence rates. It looks like they're starting to turn it around.
Well, one of the other big countries, of course, is China. And the World Bank last week, I guess it was, reevaluated the Chinese economy, declaring that they would now not have GNP as a measurement, but a PPP. And that meant that there was a 40% reduction in the growth of the Chinese economy, which put not 200 million people living on $1 a day, but 400 million, which jacks up your number. Now, this is just within the last 10 days. There's been stories about AIDS in China, concealed in villages, actually initially brought on because of blood transfers, selling of blood to the army, incidentally. Have you got any evidence as to what's happening in China? Is the reporting valid? Is it spreading, or has it been contained by the regime? And what about the impact of that many more people living on that little money?
Yeah, I think China is still somewhat unstable and still not clear. China's had kind of 2 or 3 epidemics. First of all is the epidemic that you mentioned associated with blood transfusions, well, actually associated with selling of blood and contaminated equipment. That one, in some ways, is more contained because once they recognized it, it was really more of an issue of treating people, first of all, correcting the practices, and then treating the people who were already infected. But because it wasn't sexual transmission, kind of the continued propagation didn't occur. Now what's happened is that there's the injection drug use, particularly in southern China, which is driving part of that, which looks like it's now crossing over into the population's heterosexual transmission, where, if that really happens, then the propagation will be more, because, just again, numerically, more people have sex than do drugs. And so, the potential for that, for rapid spread that way, is of concern. On the other hand, the Chinese are the only country on the face of the earth that basically wiped their syphilis epidemic away several decades ago. Whether you agree with it or not, they did with their methods. They are incredible in terms of what they did to reduce population growth. So the Chinese, when they get behind something, there is a benefit to being an authoritarian regime. You can get things done. One may not agree always with the strategies, but they are incredibly effective when they make up their minds. So the Chinese, if you look at their budget allocation to HIV, it's been like this, because they said, we get it, we see that we may have a problem, and they have really been fairly aggressive about it and much more open in a very short space of time. So I think the balance there is, can they do it in a way, and are they going to listen to kind of broader standards around this, so that they don't do it in a way that is abusive of human rights and doesn't take into consideration what the best standards are for how you work with decreasing HIV. And so, there's an openness. There seems to be an openness. There seems to be a willingness to have a much more vigorous civil society response, share information, talk with other countries about it. And I think if they do that and put their mind to it, I think there's real hope that they may be able to avoid having a serious epidemic.
The Russians, even during the Soviet period, were very conservative, if not Victorian, in the way they looked at their moral code. The Russians today have maintained that tradition, as I understand it. And I also understand that Mr. Putin and the government are really not convinced that there's a problem in Russia. Yet I understand that there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Russians that are walking around HIV positive who don't know it. Is that the case, you think, in that country? Yeah,
there's a lot of concern about Russia, as well as some of the former Soviet Union countries, and it's very much associated with injection drug use, which is high. Drug users are highly stigmatized. And drug use is a very efficient way, injection drug use is a very efficient way of spreading HIV. So it's a real concern, and they're not facing it, and there's not a lot of open, straightforward talk about it in Russia.
Because it seems to me some of these factors can be, in the final analysis, especially in Russia, where you've got the population free fall, medium term to be devastating in terms of the economy. I mean, if they don't have people and the people they have are sick, and you don't have a support system to take care of them, you're going to have very serious troubles.
Yeah, no, I think it's a big concern. Yeah.
Well, let me turn to the audience, because I think some of these folks would have some questions they might want to ask, and I'll make sure that they're easy questions, because if they're difficult, I just won't recognize them.
If they're difficult, there are other care staff
There's a gentleman here
that-
who's going to be very benign about what he's going to ask you.
Yes.
Does CARE take any position on privatization efforts or on WTO-type privatization efforts or efforts to end subsidies for state industries in third world countries?
Not specifically. That just hasn't been something that we have taken specific stands on. You know, we're thinking about whether trade broadly is an area that we should get more involved in. On the other hand, there are other organizations, Oxfam, for instance, where trade is a cornerstone of their advocacy work. You know, and we only have so many resources and just can't spread ourselves so thin. So we really try to take positions on things that are fairly directly related to our programmatic work. That one hasn't been as much, but again, partly because of some of the work around agriculture and the Farm Bill and some of those issues, and increasingly, you know, if you look at how trade can help or hurt some of the poor countries, including you know, some of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where more and more, particularly textile industry, is becoming an important part of livelihood, but the getting products to market still is a real impediment. It's an issue for us, and we may take on some of those issues. But again, we have to look at where do we put our resources, given, you know, just human capacity constraints.
Helen, in a world where the image of the United States has really suffered over the last decade, is CARE perceived as an American organization?
It increasingly not, for a couple of reasons. One, although CARE was started as a U.S. organization, we now are part of a 12-member confederation. So there's a CARE UK, CARE France, CARE Germany, et cetera, and they operate to a large degree as fundraisers, because it's a lot easier for a British NGO to go and get resources from the UK government than an American NGO. But they also provide a lot of technical resources, help in country offices. But anyway, you know, so we are now an international confederation, not just a U.S. organization. But the other main reason is that if you go out into the field, 99% of the staff in those offices come from the countries in which we work. So you don't go to a country office and see a bunch of Americans. You know, if you're in Uganda, you're going to see a bunch of Ugandans. If you're in Cambodia, you're going to see a bunch of Cambodians. So, I mean, the face of CARE is very much representative of the face of the countries in which we work.
Cedric, you have a question?
Yes, Helen, when your predecessor, Peter Bell, was here, you were suffering the deep loss of a worker in Afghanistan. It was a very tragic event. Now that the United States military is so deeply involved in, quote, nation building, how is that complicating your role, particularly in areas of conflict like Afghanistan?
Yeah, it is complicating it, and it's going to potentially get even more complicated with this new command in Africa, AFRICOM, where we're still not sure what the role of, you know, kind of a military command in Africa that is supposed to in some way help development and nation building and stability. What does that mean? And I think, you know, where the difficulty is obviously in times of conflict, it is important to have a military presence. But when the role of the military starts getting blurred, and we're asked to align more with some of these military entities, it puts our workers at risk, because in those countries, aligning with military doesn't, you know, get you big points. And it's also, you know, security will always trump development when it comes to who gets the resources. And so if increasingly more dollars are going to security forces in the military, with the idea that they're going to help in development, it means you've got soldiers trying to do the work of long-term development agencies. And what soldiers know how to do is to fight wars. What we know how to do is to work with communities on long-term development. And I think there's a real risk that if we as the United States keep seeing development only from a security lens, that we're going to have the wrong people doing the tasks that need to be done. So, I think we have real concerns about these lines kind of getting more and more blurred and not having a real strong sense that yes, security is important, but we also feel that development and the kind of work that we do is equally as important and should be in some way, whether you can say equally resourced probably is unlikely, but at least adequately resourced so that we can do the job that we do well.
To reaffirm what you're saying, we've convened 15 times the former U.S. Secretaries of Defense, and this issue of nation building has come up repeatedly, and they've said to the man that the United States military doesn't do it, that is nation building, and when they do it, they do it badly.
Yeah.
And I noticed 2 weeks ago there was an article in one of the publications that reported that the 27 maneuverable brigades on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan now had assigned to them an anthropologist, because the average soldier, as you have said, is a killing machine. He's designed to close with and destroy the enemy. And so they've now begun to do that, but it's late in the game, and so it complicates your life overseas.
And even if they're not, even if they're not putting their resources into actual combat, what they know how to do well are things like infrastructure programs, and so. That's important, but it's just half the battle. So, for instance, if you're talking about how do you get a community sustainable water, it's not just going and building the well. It's also working with the community to organize itself to maintain that well and to come up with a self-sustaining payment system so that they're keeping, doing the upkeep. Otherwise, you build the well and you come back 5 years later and it's rusted and not working, and communities have no ownership of it, and you haven't really done much. And so it's a way of working that really helps communities take ownership and look at long-term sustainability. We can't just build wells and think that that's going to answer the problem of water.
You sound like a very pragmatic person. Lincoln, coming in the back. Yes, sir, in the very back. And I'll come back to you.
Recently in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, there was an article about the president of the United Way of Metro Atlanta. He earns $446,000 a year. He has a pension of $100,000 a year, and he just got, recently, a few years ago, he got a payout of $1.2 million in bonus in a year where they were firing some of their workers because they were having cash flow problems. To me, that raises a lot of questions like why he's getting this much. The board of that organization, many of whom are corporate executives, said that they felt that they absolutely needed to pay this guy that much in order to incentivize him to work and in order to get someone of that quality. So the question is, how does CARE go about facing this issue of getting staff that's high quality and what you need versus keeping your eye on the ball? And it seems like you also have to think about the people who are donating and the people you're trying to serve and what they're getting.
Helene, what about that?
Well, one, I don't have a package like that man that you mentioned.
You got to come work at the Southern Center.
Yeah, right. It's a tough one. It really is a tough one. If I look at the pay, my board, many of whom are people who come from the corporate sector, say that I have a job that is tougher than any job that any of them have and more complicated. I don't get. I get a small fraction of what any of them make. So there is some inequity of it about it. These aren't easy jobs. On the other hand, you don't go into this business because you're interested in the financial compensation. So I think there is some balance between being fair and about getting good talent and being able to pay something that will attract somebody who basically is motivated by a desire to do good, but also needs to feed children or in my case buy clothes or I don't know. I think that you do have to take into consideration that if we don't pay decent wages, you're not going to get the kind of talent that you want. And I think in today's world, I think people are recognizing that the skills that it takes to run an organization like this, but also to attract talent for very complex jobs. In business schools these days, one of the most popular tracks is the not-for-profit management track. So it is attracting. It's kind of like Teach America. Now they say there's more kids who go to Teach America than McKinsey. Totally different than the old days. So I think it's evolving, and I think people are starting to recognize that just because you're in the not-for-profit sector, doesn't mean that you are Mother Teresa or have Mother Teresa wages. And I think it's I think it's something we've got to struggle with.
But you want to heaven first.
Yeah, well, I hope I get to heaven someday.
Beat that
sooner or later. Yes, right.
Anyway.
Yeah, right. But anyway.
Yes, sir.
Good evening, Dr. Gayle. First of all, thank you for coming tonight. Two observations regarding the food program that you talked about. It's a wise idea that you guys did that whole change because naturally the world grain prices are at its highest. Bunker fuel is at its highest, so naturally you reduce your carbon emissions or carbon footprint, as we call it. It's a great idea. Number two, I think education is everything, and I think it could solve a lot of problems in the Middle East today. Has Karen thought about maybe offering student scholarships or teaching scholarships to people in the Middle East or Latin America or Asia as part of their, part of the educational aspect of promoting that part of it?
So you're saying for people who want to go teach
or even recruit locals to have them get into teaching or offering students scholarships? Because as they grow up and they mature, they could also eventually get into care, work with care. There's some multiplying factors there that maybe could build the organization in the future as well.
Yeah, just trying to think of how that works. I mean, we're looking at a lot of ways in which we can partner with organizations that that there would be a reciprocal benefit, so that by going and working in a care program, they may be helping the program, but they also learn a lot. So we have some potential activities with some programs that work with urban youth that we might be able to send them to spend some time in care sites, and they learn and they also provide a service. So we're looking at ways of doing things like what I think you're suggesting. It's tough because, again, a lot of the work that we do is not, I give the example, Habitat for Humanity is a wonderful organization. It's a wonderful organization anyway, but it's also a wonderful organization to plug volunteers into, because you do something real tangible. You go over there, you build a house, you feel good, you've done something. We don't have kind of the equivalent in the work that we do. It's very labor intensive, it's very long term. It's establishing relationships with communities that build trust over years. So it's not as easy to just parachute people in to do the kind of things that we do. So we keep struggling with that because we recognize that people having those experiences is incredibly valuable for them, as well as can be useful for the programs themselves. So, but I think you're right. The point that you started with, education is key.
Another question? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gayle. I'm going to be the devil's advocate. I think the figure is still 80 to 85% of the USAID dollar that actually stays in the United States in terms of goods and services and technical assistance. And with, I don't know what percentage of your funds are still USAID, but if you get any, it tends to influence what you do. So you work in about 4 sectors. There are sectoral limitations. Very little is being done about long-term development. So my question to you is this. Peter, we're off the record, aren't we?
No.
Oh. Well, I wanted to ask her. Oh.
You've already done it now, so you know.
No, my question is, we'll soon have someone else in the White House, and each time there's a new holder of that office, you have new aid policies. And I wonder, as someone who's been in the aid field, what kind of recommendations would you make to a new administration on how they could improve U.S. bilateral foreign assistance?
Yeah, it's a good point. You know, one, and we get about 50% of our funding from U.S. From governments, most of that being the U.S. government. You know, one, I think, longer-term funding. You can't do development in 18-month cycles or 3-month cycles, because what people are doing is spending their whole time getting grants ready, recompeting each time. And so, you know, if you want to have an impact, then you've got to think about longer-term funding. It also needs to be, and so, you know, coming up with ways of doing 5-year horizons with the ability to have that renewable and not have to necessarily go through the whole competitive cycle again. I think also being much more able to be integrated. You know, the funding is incredibly stovepiped, and you know, you go, if you're talking about what can you do to change communities, there is no magic bullet. It's not just, well, gee whiz, they need access to clean water, and if we do that, poverty is gone. Or if you, you know, do a microfinance program, you do that, and everything is fine. It really is you know, it is about having integrated programs that really can, you know, be synergistic and have a greater impact. So I think, you know, those two things alone, being able to be more integrated, less stovepiped, and more long-term, would go a huge way in having a much more, you know, much more reasonable development portfolio. You know, and I think having more balanced funding in general. So I'm thrilled, as somebody who's worked in HIV for most of my professional career, that we had this $15 billion PEPFAR, you know, president's funding, and that people are now pushing for numbers like 30 billion or 50 billion. But at the same time, funds for maternal and child health and nutrition and water and agriculture are either static or going in the other direction. And so all of our efforts on HIV, you know, are going to be short-term gains, because if people don't have adequate nutrition, along with taking their HIV meds and, you know, all the rest, and if you don't have money to make sure that children have access to health services, so if your mother who's HIV infected takes the drugs to keep her baby from getting infected, but then, you know, there's no way to get vaccinations, you know, what have we actually done? So I think being able to adequately resource the different development streams, and to do it in a much more long-term way, and to allow for much more integrated programs, you know, would be at least a start.
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Gayle, what do you see as the biggest barrier to economic development in the developing world? Is it poverty? Is it illiteracy? Is it corruption? Dysfunctional governments? What do you see as?
I think it's all of those. You know, I think there's no one thing that you can ever point to. You know, the book Bottom Billion by Paul Collier, I don't know if people have seen that, but you know, he, you know, said basically that you know, we don't, that if you look at the people who are really trapped at the bottom billion, you know, there's a lot of, if you look at the global poor, you know, there are a lot of countries that have had incredible economic growth in what used to be considered developing countries that are now middle income, and even in poor countries, you know, there's some that it's very clear that they will be out of poverty in 10 years, and there's some that you look at and wonder, will they ever get out of it? And it's a combination, you know, of kind of the obvious factors of not having some of the basic life necessities, but also things like poor governance and corruption and conflict and things that keep people mired in poverty, that really keeps them trapped. So I think you can't look at just these things like clean water and education and health and whatever without looking at what are some of these other factors that are also important for stability. Now, we're not an we work some at that level of, working with governments themselves and working with political leaders. But what we try to do a lot to influence that is working with the communities that we work with to get them to hold their governments accountable. So if you can work with, again, let me use the example of water, where oftentimes why people aren't getting access to water is that they have to bribe the local person who has jurisdiction over that, and if you don't bribe them, you don't get the water. Well, if we can get communities to stand up and say, sorry, none of us are going to pay you the bribe, then ultimately you start changing that system. And if you can start working at the ground level in getting people to understand that they have the right to hold their governments accountable, then we can help at that level and also help at the higher policy level and hopefully make a change in those circumstances.
Yes, sir. No, you
You mentioned earlier that your board noted how difficult it is to run an organization like CARE. What are your biggest challenges in being successful and looking back in a few years and saying, can we accomplish what we set out to do?
Well, one, I think, it's several of the questions have noted, it's complicated. If there was one magic bullet to end poverty and you could just go around and, do that everywhere, it would make it a lot easier. But it's a complex set of circumstances that are very difficult and long-term to have an impact on. I think second is funding. If we could wave a magic wand and say that we had all the resources that we wanted, and we could staff up and, have all the expertise we wanted, I think that would be, our job would be a lot easier. Three, I think, there's not the political will that there needs to be. I think we have gotten as a world so accustomed to thinking that some people have to be poor while others are rich, or better off, without realizing that, in fact, we don't have to do that. If we, as a society, if we were really committed to ending global poverty, we could do it. We're a rich world. We could make the difference, but it takes an incredible amount of political will. People have to put it high on the priority, and we just haven't. So those are some of the things, and we're a large, big, complex organization. So that in and of itself, with multiple nationalities and cultures and all that is inherent in that. So.
Yes, sir.
I was just going to ask, as far as advancing technologies and computers and so forth, and every child have a computer in Africa, is there any, do you feel there's any hope there as far as, like mosquito nets having videos that kids can watch that are animated or whatever and teach a lot of these things? Is it possible that are you guys beginning to use these advanced technologies and videos on demand and that sort of thing?
We're starting to do more in technology. I don't think we're doing enough. I do believe that technology has a huge ability to make big leaps in how we can make people's lives easier. We just haven't invested enough in it as an organization. It's something that I want to do more of. On the other hand, technology alone is never just the answer. I was at a session last week at Davos at this World Economic Forum, and one of the discussions was about this very issue, that kind of on one side there were people who said technology can solve it all, and the other side people who were saying, well, no, it's not just technology. And somebody gave the example of the solar ovens that had been created that were used, that were created to be a way of of having clean fuel and for people in developing countries, but didn't think about the fact that many places women only cook at night. So if you have a solar oven and women work during the day in the fields or whatever and then cook at night, what have you done? And so you've got to take into consideration what are the human aspects of it. Are you thinking about that when you design it, or are you just coming up with an idea and saying, I'm going to parachute it in, and not taking, kind of human behavior into consideration? And so many technologies that we develop, we don't then make sure that they actually get to the people who need them, and that we look at how are they able to adapt to it, and some of these other things. So I think technology has a huge role in changing and leapfrogging development, but we've got to think about the other sides of it too.
Yes, ma'am. Sir, you had a question.
Just want to go back to what Mr. White was talking about, the BRIC countries, excluding Brazil. He talked about HIV. And 4 years ago, when they had vice presidential debate and blame IFL from PBS.
Oh, yeah. Right. Right.
Dick Cheney and John Edwards at the time about the African American community here
Right.
with HIV, and both of them didn't know anything what they wanted to talk about.
Right.
I just wanted you to elaborate a little bit more about the African American community and HIV here.
Yeah, well, having worked much of my career, both on between domestic and international, it's quite interesting, because when I first started in HIV, it was all the concern about what was going on in this country. Then we started realizing that there was a global epidemic, and, we kind of went all the way to thinking only about global HIV, and, have forgotten that there's also, 40,000 people who get infected in this country every year needlessly and in a rich nation, and that it is disproportionately impacting communities of color, particularly African Americans, who make up about 50% of new HIV in this country, and that it's starting to have a huge impact on women here, just like it is around the world. So 30% of our new HIV infections now are women. Compare that to when I first started working in HIV, and maybe about 8% of AIDS cases, which was all we had as a proxy for infection, were among women. So, we have an epidemic here that has serious repercussions on certain communities, and we've kind of, abandoned it. And I think the advent of great treatments has been wonderful, because it's made a huge impact on the quality of people's lives. AIDS wards have been shut down in most major hospitals, but it means that we've forgotten that this is still a serious problem for us in this country, and that it's, that we have an unacceptably high rate. That, in the United States of America, that 40,000 people are still getting infected, and that, I guess the estimates now are about a quarter of people who are infected with HIV don't even know it in this country. I mean, that's absurd. So, we still have a lot of work to do here, and I think, HIV is one of these diseases that continually exposes the kind of the fault lines in our society. It continues to show that there are parts of our society that are left out, that are excluded, that are more vulnerable, and shows that we aren't an equal society here either.
If you could, like you said, wave a magic wand, everybody's fed. There's water for everyone. Is there enough? When do we ever make the decision that you have to choose? Because I've been overseas plenty of times with the military. There isn't enough food. There isn't enough water for everyone. There isn't enough asphalt. There isn't not enough concrete. There's not enough telephone poles. There's not enough copper wire. When do we ever get to that point where we have to choose who gets it? Because you can't wave a magic wand and have everything in Africa perfect, ever. It'll never be. There's not enough. We've used up the resources. There won't be any renewals. So when do we, as an organization, have to choose who gets the, we do choose now who gets the stuff, but I've been to Africa. There isn't enough roads. There'll never be a sidewalk in every corner. There will never be a well in every city, because there isn't enough for it to go around. I mean, they're having problems in China now. I never thought copper would be so expensive. People are stealing it out of homes in America. We're running out of water here in Atlanta, Georgia. I mean, we will have to make that decision. That's a bad organization to having to choose. Eventually, in our lifetime, we will have to choose amongst ourselves, Georgia versus Alabama, Georgia versus Tennessee, who will get the water. We're already doing it now. And it's very low lying, but we will be fighting for ourselves. And I know,
Melinda, you ready to go down and talk to the governor of Georgia about that issue? Tomorrow.
Well, I think I've got enough on my plate.
I've talked to people who go, there isn't enough food to feed everyone.
Well, I don't think that it's a question of not enough. I mean, I think we could do a lot more, and will we ever not have people who, relative to others may have less? I mean, I think that it's a long time off before everybody is fed or whatever, but I don't think it's a question of a lack of the ability to provide for people. I think we don't use our resources wisely. I think that, there's a part of the world that overuses the globe's resources, and, I don't think we've yet started thinking seriously about what is it going to take to solve the water problem. Well, it's not about Georgia versus Alabama. It's about us turning off our lights and, using water more reasonably and starting to stop being so selfish about the resources that we have and realize that, if we don't, we're not thinking about our future. So I think, and again, back to the thing about technology, I think there's an incredible amount that can be done, looking at drought-resistant seeds that could produce a lot more, even in areas that currently aren't able to produce enough food. I think there are ways of which we could get water more equitably distributed. So I don't think it's about, and yes, roads are awful, but I think that, if we put our resources to it, we could build roads, even in some of the poorest countries. And if you look at countries, I've seen countries that in space of 10, 15 years have made tremendous strides. So I don't think it's that there's just not enough to go around. I think we're not smart about how we use the resources that we have to make them more available and more equitable.
Unfortunately, we have time for just one question. I promised this lady in the back row to.
Hi. You mentioned political will and political pressure and the importance of advocacy, especially in Washington, D.C. How do you see the role of CARE volunteer advocates changing and developing beyond this year of election?
Well, we think it's very important this year because we want to make sure that the issues of global poverty are high on the radar screen of political candidates. But our commitment to have a volunteer force, this CARE Action Network, is long term, and so we're continuing to develop and build that network of volunteers. We have, I forget the number now, I don't know if any of you all know how many thousands of CAN volunteers, 50,000 people that we count among our volunteers through this network. Each year, the conference that we have in Washington is larger and larger. It's an exciting opportunity, and any of you who want to come, it really is, it's very inspiring to see this network of people from all across the country who come together. We're going to keep doing it because we need more people, not less, to be the voice of the poor, not only in Washington. We're also doing a lot more advocacy at the country level because I don't think we should let governments the countries in which we work off the hook either. They have a real responsibility to be much more much better stewards for their populations and really look at what policies do they have in place and what kind of changes do they need. So, we're working both at the U.S. level and international level, but we also work on advocacy at the country level as well.
I promise you, this will be the last question. Otherwise, she's going to kill me.
I was being courteous. You asked me. Helene, I want to end on a note because I think, were minimizing your role. I appreciate, yes, the Mother Teresa's or those out in the field. But those of us who have known you, and for, in my case, half my life fighting HIV/AIDS,
we know the work you've done in the trenches on the ground. So we're thankful that now you have a visionary leadership position. You stand on the shoulders of giants, of long history here at Atlanta in terms of global partnerships. But I just want to make sure that this audience who may not have that opportunity is aware of that. Secondly, I wanted to ask you in terms of, well,
That was
say
an
thank you.
unsolicited testimonial.
No, I mean, absolutely. Just secondly, as Honorary Consul of Botswana, I feel it's really important that I thank you and the decades of leadership that you've played in partnership with Botswana in reducing the HIV/AIDS rates that you've mentioned earlier. And then lastly, coming back from Davos, I was thinking about like Queen Rania this week and the role that women have globally in pursuing advocacy. Could you close and sharing with us some of maybe anecdotal in terms of the extraordinary women in leadership positions that you've worked with, whether it's Ellen in Liberia or it's in Botswana or across the globe, or the Janet Museveni's? I mean, give us some positive examples of how women and Africans are empowered, not just victims of crisis.
Yeah, no, it's great, and I appreciate your comments. I'm not meaning to minimize it, but I really do think it's been a privilege to have the kind of opportunities I've had. It's what I wanted to do with life. So with my life, and I don't, and nobody does these things alone. And so I feel privileged to have had opportunities to make a contribution. But I wouldn't be able to if it wasn't for the many people who are involved. I think you threw out some of the names. Obviously, Janet Museveni, wife of President Museveni of Uganda, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, incredible people. But I really take a lot of my inspiration from people whose names you'll never know. The people the women that we see, and not just women, but people who we see in communities who take courageous stands and who really show incredible leadership potential at all levels, and so I just I think anywhere you go, when you talk to people and realize that you have the opportunity to change their lives, when I talk to women who say it wasn't until I was given the opportunity to learn to read that the light bulbs went off, and they can say the kind of the exact moment where I went from darkness to all of a sudden having light. Imagine growing up all your life and never knowing how to read and never having this basic skill that we take for granted, to be able to unlock a whole different way of living. For something else that I'm doing tomorrow, we were looking at issues of leadership in women, and looking at some of the experiences. And one of the stories we were talking about is looking at the women in Afghanistan. Here in Afghanistan, where the role of women is probably among the worst. We visited women in a savings and loans, a microfinance group. And talking to these women about what difference it made for them to have access to money, start businesses, become contributors to their family. And when you ask them, well, does this, in this kind of very conservative society, does this add to tension in the family now that you have some money and are a little bit more independent? And they said, not at all. Our husbands look at us as contributors. They see us differently. We're not just kind of chattel anymore. We actually have value within the family. And so those are the kinds of things that I take inspiration from, because things are changing. It is making a difference, and you can tangibly see that you're touching people's lives, and that they'll never be different again. They'll never be the same again. And that even though it may not make the headlines, these are the things that give me hope that in fact we can make a difference, and we really can turn back extreme poverty. And I think we can do it in my lifetime. So anyway.
Well, Helene Gayle, President and CEO of CARE, we've enjoyed this immensely. This has been illuminating and inspiring, and we hope you'll come back soon. Thank you for taking time.
Thank you.